Hi, it's Michelle Ockers, and this is what I learned in February 2019. Now, I had a super busy month in February, but as usual, I've just picked three things to talk about today. I went over to the Learning Technologies UK conference in London. One of the keynote speakers, Daniel Susskind, talked about the future of work and artificial intelligence. He's written a book with his father called The Future of the Professions, and it really challenged me to think a little bit differently, to develop a new curiosity about where is learning and development going as a profession, which kind of tied in nicely with my own presentation at the conference, which was about the learning and development profession. Daniel spoke about artificial intelligence and the implications of artificial intelligence for professions and for learning and development. And one of the things I learned is the difference between the first wave mindset about artificial intelligence and the second wave mindset. Now, the first wave happened in the 1980s, and at this point in time, the thinking was that if people can't explain how they perform a task, which we know is often difficult because of deeply embedded expertise, so if they can't explain how they perform a task, where on earth do we begin to write an instruction for a machine to do it? This has been subsequently overturned or labelled the AI fallacy, the mistaken assumption that the only way to develop systems that perform tasks at the level of experts or higher is to replicate the thinking processes of the human specialists. In this second wave, which we're in now of artificial intelligence, we no longer expect AI to be smart in the same ways as people. We don't expect machines to think in the same ways as people or to be creative or empathic in the same ways as people. However, this doesn't mean that they can only do routine tasks. What the assumption has failed to recognise is that machines can increasingly perform tasks that might require creativity, that might require judgment and empathy when performed by a human, but increasingly can be performed by machines just in different ways. So they are smart in different ways to us. What this really opened up my mind to is that as learning and development professionals, we should challenge our assumptions that our expertise may be creating blind spots and that the future of learning could look very different to the way it looks now. And this kind of ties in with an article I read recently by Josh Bersin, which was actually published in November last year, where he talked about the future of human resources technology, for instance. So he spoke about this front-ending of learning management systems and the fact that whilst learning management systems may not go away, in the future, users may not access them directly, but through artificial intelligence and predictive analytics, what may end up happening, and he's sort of pretty confident that this is going to happen and in the not too distant future, is that there will be an integration between learning management systems or other content management systems and the systems we use to do our work in. For instance, Salesforce was one he talked about, on Microsoft Teams. And there will be this sensitivity to detecting what an individual needs as they work and suggesting resources or courses or giving them nudges, but through the other platforms that they're working in, which I can actually see that happening. So that's one example of how learning may be managed in different ways or presented in different ways. There are probably others which we just don't have our heads around. So I've got this curiosity now to go out and start exploring what might learning really look like in the future, and to challenge the assumptions or the mental models I have at the moment based on my experience of learning to this point, and open myself up to the possibility that it could look very different into the future. The second thing I wanted to share that I learned was something that really gave me a jolt at Learning Technologies, and it's to do with the fact that learning and development is falling further behind in terms of our skills relative to where we need to be. I'll put up an image of a graph that represents this. Now, this graph is from the Towards Maturity's annual research report. This year it's called the Transformation Journey. It was launched while I was at LT UK. What the report basically shows, or what this diagram shows, is that the readiness of learning and development is a major barrier to getting the kind of impact and results that we aspire to in organisations. And as you can see there, the higher or bigger bar graphs on the spider diagram, or bars on the spider diagram, are what learning and development professionals, there's over 700 of them represented in this data from around the world, that's what they're saying is needed in place with skills. The smaller overlaid bars show what they believe they have in place now, and the red stars, which might be a little bit hard to discern, but the red stars show what percentage of L&D leaders were saying they had skills in place in 2016. And as you can see, across every single set of skill in this spider graph, the skill level in place has contracted since 2016. And this, I've got to say, was like a big wake-up call to me. I've been quite optimistic in the last 2 years about the direction we're heading with learning and development, and the potential for us to increase our impact. But this data really threw me and made me sit back and think about the ongoing pace of change, and really question for the first time whether learning and development is going to be able to keep up. So my last lesson for February relates to something I learned from experience. I ran a full day workshop to develop capability plans for a learning and development team. I had already planned out the full agenda when the client asked me to include some time on the agenda for individual development planning. I should have resisted that in retrospect. I didn't. I added it into the agenda. I cut back on some of the time that I factored in for the team development planning and cut back on some of the activities. As it turned out, on the day, we really did need the extra time for the team capability development planning. And had to rejig the agenda on the spot. We didn't get to the individual capability development plan. I had to revert and introduce at a later point some of the things I'd taken out of the team capability development planning to get us where we needed to be with that. So the lesson there is, when it comes to workshops, less is more on the agenda. Quick preview for March's What I Learned. I've been doing a lot of reading and development work around building learning culture. I'm going to be running workshops later this year with Nigel Payne in Australia and New Zealand on building learning culture. And I'm going to start sharing some of what I'm learning in the process of preparing for those workshops. Please join in and share what you've been learning throughout 2019.